is your, your view of that use of force during that time period?
Totally unnecessary.
Oh.
What do you mean?
Well, first of all, pulling him down to the ground, face down, and putting your knee on the neck for that amount of time is just uncalled for. I saw no reason why the officers felt they were in danger, if that's what they felt. And that's what they would have to feel to be able to use that kind of force.
Stop. New question.
So, in your opinion, should that restraint have stopped once he was handcuffed and prone on the ground?
Absolutely.
Whoops. That was devastating. That's where we left off last week. This is now week 2 in the trial of Derek Chauvin, the man who is accused of murdering George Floyd in front of everybody's eyes, everybody's ears. And what you see the prosecution doing is building their case based on their opening statement. They tell you what they're going to tell you, and then they show you what they're going to tell you, and then at the end, in the closing, they will tell you what they told you. That is a successful prosecution. And so what they've begun to do is prove their opening statement true. And their opening statement was very simple. Their opening statement was that there was an unlawful use of force against George Floyd that led to his death, that caused his death. So we started out, week 1, the very first witness that we heard was Jenna Scurry. Jenna Scurry was the 911 operator who took the first call for service. She actually testified that she thought that her video screen that was showing her a city camera of the of Cup Foods had frozen because the police officers didn't move. They just stayed on the neck of George Floyd for so long. Turns out it was 9 minutes and 29 seconds that she thought that the camera had frozen. Her instincts told her something was horribly wrong on this call. And so she then called the sergeant. The sergeant is the person who is the frontline supervisor for patrol officers. The sergeant was Sergeant Pfluger. Sergeant Pfluger went to the call, okay? When he got there, he was not told by Derek Chauvin or any of the other officers that they had been standing on George Floyd's neck. They just left that part out, okay? Now remember that the 911 operator, Jenna Scurry, had called him because something felt wrong and it looked really wrong to her. And so now you have the sergeant on duty responding to her call to go out there and see what happened. Well, he said that, first of all, if they had him in handcuffs, they should have sat him up. Okay, he should have been sat up or rolled on his side, because when your hands are literally tied behind your back, your chest muscles expand, and if you're laying prone on the ground on top of your chest, and then you have a human being on top of you on top of that, you're probably not going to be able to breathe, and you probably will asphyxiate. All right. But he testified that he was not told at all by Chauvin or Tao or King or any of the officers, Lane, that were present, that they had sat on top of George Floyd. In fact, he said the cops neglected to say this until they got to the medical examiner's office. Once the cops were all in the medical examiner's office with the sergeant, that is when Derek Chauvin finally said what he had done. Now we get the testimony Friday afternoon from Lieutenant Zimmerman. Now, Lieutenant Zimmerman is the longest serving police officer on the Minneapolis police force, and he is a homicide supervisor. He's called out to the scene after the fact to do the investigation into cause of death, into what happened at the scene, and he testifies devastatingly, okay? And I think Pfluger's testimony was pretty devastating too, where he actually testifies that no one told him that they had sat on top of George Floyd until everybody's at the medical examiner's office. Now, something weird happens at the medical examiner's office. I don't know exactly what. We'll find out because the medical examiner will be called to the stand. But now we have the lieutenant testifying last week, Lieutenant Zimmerman, Richard Zimmerman. And he repeatedly testifies that there is no reason at all for any of this to have happened with regard to standing or kneeing on this man's neck.
In your training as a Minneapolis police officer, are you provided with training on medical intervention?
Yes.
I assume you're not, taught to be paramedics, but you receive some level of training.
Yeah, we're first responders, I think, is what our category would be.
Does that include doing what we think of as CPR, chest compressions?
Yes.
And how often is that part of your training?
CPR, it's like every other year or so.
And as part of your training within the Minneapolis Police Department policies, is there an obligation to provide medical intervention when necessary?
Absolutely.
Okay, so once you have a suspect in custody, meaning in handcuffs, they belong to you. And your obligation and your training is that you provide them with first aid. You provide medical aid. You do CPR until the paramedics arrive, and then the paramedics do CPR or whatever they need to do in an ambulance situation or in a first responder situation until they get to the ER, and then a ER doctor takes over. So there are 3 levels of obligation to render medical aid, and the first one begins at the scene. So now we know that Chauvin lied about what he did and did not provide any first aid. We now know that Sergeant Pfluger, who was called by the 9/11 operator to go investigate this use of force episode, was not told that force was used. Was not told until they got to the medical examiner's office, which of course is bizarre. And then you have the homicide investigator show up at the scene, and he testifies to the fact that the use of force was absolutely unnecessary. It was overkill, literally, and that there was a requirement to provide first aid. Okay, so that brings us up to date, sort of, kind of. Now we have the highest ranking officer in the Minneapolis police force. We now have the chief of police on the stand today, whose name, as you know, is Arredondo. Okay. Now, Chief Arredondo is the person who fired Derek Chauvin and the 3 other officers. He fired all of them. And last summer, he was on the television responding to the family of George Floyd in real time. Remember, he took his hat off to address the family. And he said what happened here, it doesn't seem right, and that these people would be fired because it was wrong what he saw on that videotape. So this morning he's been testifying, and when somebody first takes the stand, they're asked a lot of qualifying questions, and those questions go to what is your job, how old are you, how long have you been on the force, what were your different positions on the force as you rose to the chief of the Minneapolis Police Department. And so we've been listening to all of that this morning, finding out what his experiences have been, and 2 years here and 2 years there, and then the training that he goes through every year, and then the updating of the post-training, which is, peace officers training that he does all the time, and how they now are trained on Narcan. They're now trained on, CPR regularly. They're trained on rendering aid. They're trained on use of force, right? And so we're now getting into the sort of the way you approach a suspect. And he's just testified that there's a graph, and the graph says that you arrive in a neutral posture. You have to respect and trust the suspect, and then proceed. Don't have time to listen to the live show? Want to hear more on your schedule? Go to randyrhodes.com and buy a stinking podcast.